Professor SUMIOKA's University Standard Philosophy course. Hi everyone! Wait, so we're going to learn all about rationalism in today's one lesson?
Yeah, because that was a philosophical fashion, only of 100 years in the 17th century.
However, many famous philosophers such as Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz will appear there. Some professors even spend the whole year for this theme.
Indeed, they might be typical philosophers, but today, no one but cultic professors believe in such bizarre worldviews.
In short, they are now useless, right?
That's it, they are the ones in the transition from theology to science, and we study them to understand how we have conquered the curse of God.
Anyway, Descartes comes first.
The son of a French legal aristocrat, Descartes was a sickly bookworm, who studied at a Jesuit school, but in his quest to understand reality, he traveled to Germany, Italy, and Paris, during the 30 Years' War, and then retreated to the Netherlands.
Like Montaigne, he was a pioneer of withdrawers.
However, unlike Montaigne, he had no interest in human beings, and unlike Aristotle and scholasticism, he would not learn the predecessors. Instead, he rather believed that an alone rational person's idea is more sophisticated than a mixed-up opinion of many people. In fact, he single-handedly created the base of analytic geometry, to solve geometric problems through algebraic calculation.
Genius he might be, but arrogant.
Actually, at that time, the Catholics and the Protestants were fighting in the 30 Years' War of Germany, as well as within France and Britain. Descartes wondered why people disagree, despite having the same reason. Suspecting misusing of reason, he anonymously published in French, the Discourse on the Method, How to Use Reason Correctly, in 1637.
To him, other people fighting probably looked stupid.
He says that, for the time being, we should follow a provisional morality, that is, we should conform to the laws and customs of our country, our own resolution, and the world order, and change our desires. Next, as methodological skepticism, he hyperbolically tried to exclude all that he could doubt. However, he found at last, only one fact remains, that he is doubting. Thus, he realized cogito ergo sum, namely, I think, so at least I exist.
I think even a ghost may doubt whether he had died. Then does that mean the ghost exists?
Well, that may be not enough. So, from the fact of his existence doubting, he demonstrated God's existence. Doubt is thinking of something as imperfect, but I am also imperfect, so God should exist, as the one who gave me the idea of perfect. Furthermore, when I recognize something clearly, the clarity is perfect, so it is proven not by imperfect me, but by the perfect God.
God already had been so poor to be doubted his existence unless proven.
In 1641, he wrote again in Latin, the Meditations on First Philosophy, in which he re-explained his previous discourse in detail, against the rebuttals. It consists of 6 days of meditation. On the first day, he tries to doubt everything to find the absolute thing. His sensations of the exterior things are not credible, even his thought in his interior may be made wrong by the evil demon. The second day, he finds himself existing at least, even when the whole world does not exist. On the third day, he proves God's existence, through his imperfection and God's perfection. The perfect God with veracity, never deceives him. The fourth day, then, where do errors occur? Errors are imperfect, and made when his liberty judges things, unless his intelligence understands them clearly and distinctly. Clear means transparent, and distinct means without adulterant. The fifth day, so what should he do? For clarity and distinctness, he has to recognize things not sensationally, but physically and mathematically only on space, time, and movement. And in the last 6th day, indeed he can exist without his body, but, as long as he has the tendency to believe in the exterior reality, the nature is given by God, and God has veracity, the exterior world really exists.
He rebuilt the world in 6 days, just like God did. But his mathematical conclusion, like Plato, was doubtful.
Yeah, his meditations raise troubling problems. First, if a person exists by thinking, then when the person thinks nothing, for example in sleep, the person does not exist. In addition, if the person thinks just different things, the person also becomes a different existence.
Wow, if I let my guard down for a moment, I lose track of who I am.
For that problem, Descartes answered it is true, and he said, that rather proves God's existence. God recreates our mind, so that we can keep respective identities. This is called, the doctrine of continuous creation.
According to him, the mind is made like frame pictures in animation film.
Second, as Descartes was concerned, even if the thinking person and what the person thinks exist, they may be just images only in the person's mind, and may not exist really. In short, what really exists in the world, may be only the person himself. It is called solipsism. So, Descartes had the perfect God with veracity, assure the real existence of what the person recognized clearly and distinctly.
God should not be Descartes' servant.
Third, even if their real existences are thus guaranteed, that is merely physical surface. Anyway, the person can never know the inside. So simply, Descartes viewed animals as mindless biological machines. As for other people, he said that we may imagine what they think from their external gestures, but that these are in fact things of our minds, and we never know even whether their minds actually exist or not.
Descartes is saying that, in principle, we cannot distinguish between robots and living things, right? Or rather, as a misanthrope, does he want to say that even robots are good enough?
However, fourth, this problem extends to ourselves as well. In his view, we also can only imagine the experiences of our own bodies, from their external gestures, much less communicate to our bodies what our mind desires. Descartes focused on the pineal gland, which is located in the center of the brain, and has room to move, and he believed that its physical vibrations corresponded to the mind. The pineal gland is said to be connected to the whole body, through spiritus animalis, and to transmit the sensations of the whole body to the mind, and also to transmit the desires of the mind, to movements of the whole body.
It's as if we ourselves were remote-controlled robots. So after all, where are our minds existing? Perhaps the minds are also just our ideas of our minds.
The question to ask the place of the minds may be nonsense to Descartes. Fifth, he distinguished ideas with strength, and things with extension, regarding their ways to exist quite different. It meant that, apart from physical space-time of things with mathematical extension, there is another metaphysical world, which consists only of ideas. It was called mind-body dualism.
When the conclusion is thus wrong, then the premise is in the first place wrong. Isn't that a proof by contradiction?
However, his followers, known as Cartesians, devoted themselves to making the story add up, under the influence of Jansenism. Jansen was a theological professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Based on Augustine, he criticized the Jesuits' casuistry in its spiritual exercises, namely easy reasoning by superficial analogy from other cases. Like the Protestants, he insisted that we humans are tainted by the sin of free will, so impotent without God's grace. Therefore, we should surrender everything, individually to the principle, that is, God himself. After he died, his book was published in 1640, and Jansenism spread by a theologian Antoine Arnauld of the Abbey of Port Royal, but the Pope declared this to be heresy in 1653.
As Luther and Calvin had broken away from Catholic theology at the time was burglarized, so it was no surprise that it was criticized from within it.
Pascal, living off his father's inheritance, began to defend Arnaud's Jansenism, in 1654, writing anonymously, the Provincial Letters. They are in the form of correspondences from a Parisian to a provincial friend, and make fun of the Jesuits with wit. At that time, Jansenism was charged by the Jesuits and the Dominicans, but the first 4 letters pointed out that Jansenism and the Dominicans were rather the same. While the Jesuits said, only God's grace is enough for being saved, Jansenism and the Dominican thought that we also should have pouvoir prochain, namely, the preparing ability worth being saved, in advance.
Even if not by good deeds, they believed that those who would be saved are beforehand limited, like Calvin's predestination theory.
In the 5th letter, Pascal now criticized the probabilism of the Jesuits. It was not on the modern estimation of chances, but the ability to be proved, in the etymological meaning. The Jesuits insisted, to avoid troubles and to match diversity, we should follow authorities that support their deed. However, Pascal cynically admired their casuistry, saying, it's amazing. We may do whatever we want to do, if we just find some authority that supports what we want to do.
The Jesuits might not realize that they were fallen into secular reasoning. So I hear, the Jesuits of the time were involved in many shady activities all over the world, including political intrigue and the slave trade, just as they liked.
Pascal was also a semi-pro dilettante of science and mathematics, and he was in contact with the leading scholars of the time. Galileo's pupil, Torricelli, discovered atmospheric pressure in 1643, from the limit of the rise of the mercury column. Pascal reproduced this experiment, and believed that the space of the column above the mercury is a vacuum. Furthermore, he invented a booster pump, by applying the law of constant pressure in a closed vessel.
It is so-called Pascal's principle, right?
As a gambler, he was interested also in the probability in the modern meaning, and established the theory of expected value. So, criticizing Descartes, who limited clear and distinct problems with a unique and absolute answer, he advocated esprit de finesse, or the sensitive mind, that intuitively grasps the whole, even if the answer is ambiguous. With the word, man is a thinking reed, he indeed assumed, like Descartes, that our mind can involve the universe, even if our body is weak. However, his universe is not of the mind and the body, but embraced by the grace of God. In other words, Pascal thought the universe with three orders: body, mind, and God's grace. So, through grasping the vague expectation of God's grace, by the sensitive mind, he bet on faith, as his wager.
For him, a Jansenist, both of the body and the mind are quite impotent, and only God's grace would rule even his cousin dies.
As same as Jansen, Galenx was a professor at the University of Leuven, but lost his post due to his Jansenism, in 1658, so, converting to Calvinism, he moved to the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. He was a Cartesian, but denied Descartes' pineal gland theory, and instead insisted, the extreme solipsism, in his Ethica in 1665. According to it, the mind is quite impotent, to do something in the external world. So we should be more modest and devout. However, within God, the grace realizes our hope in every occasion. That was Occasionalism.
There was a way of thinking that applies the continuous creation theory to the body as well as the mind.
Monk Marlbranche in Paris was a Cartesian influenced by Augustine, although he was not a Jansenist, but rather close to the Jesuit. He wrote The Search After Truth, in 1674-75. According to him, as well as Descartes' argument of the idea of perfect, we are not an apple, so we don't have the idea of an apple, nevertheless we can recognize an apple, because God gives us the sentiment of an apple. However, we are impotent to keep it. So, God modifies our mind to the sentiment of an apple, each occasion when we see an apple. Namely, only God keeps the idea of an apple, and we get the sentiment of an apple, from the vision of an apple in God.
It's a sort of the revival of Plato's anamnesis theory.
Marlbranche said that, everything, not only the mind but also the body, is impotent, independent of each other without relation, cannot change even itself, in the first place, does not know even what it should change to. However, only God knows what it should be, and modifies it all on each occasion, following his vision, so that everything is in harmony.
They are like cell-drawn animation characters, painted on separate layers, who cannot change on their own, and who do not interact with each other.
It seemed just an expansion of Galenx, but the old Jansenist Arnauld snapped Marlbranche. If eternal ideas and the formula for change are kept beforehand in God, and God has to modify various things following them, then, where does God his free grace with miracles? According to Arnauld, Marlbranche reduced God to a slave power of a mechanical nature. In fact, just as Marlbranche regarded nature, animals, and even humans, as impotent dead material, he no longer recognized God as a person, but as reason itself, or something like a universal physical law.
Oh, that was deism, wasn't that?
Spinoza was the son of a wealthy Jewish merchant in the Netherlands. However, the business was ruined by the Anglo-Dutch Wars. In addition, his father died. To skip out on his debts to the Jewish community, he selfishly renounced his inheritance right, so he was excommunicated from Judaism, in 1656. Nevertheless, receiving some pension, he lived as an easy dilettante, afterward.
He had probably hidden his remained assets in investments, so he enraged his fellow Jews.
Against the Calvinists, a politician, Jan de Witt, ruled the Netherlands, pushing for global expansion and foreign wars, as Dutch Golden Age. Spinoza anonymously published the Theologico-Political Treatise, in 1670, in which he denied supernatural miracles, furthermore God's personality, therefore his intention, namely predestination. Instead of God, he insisted, we need national sovereignty like De Witt, and only under the power will, we can enjoy freedom.
Was he a supporter of the dictator?
Yeah, his book received strong backlash. The ruler Jan de Witt was also killed by a civil riot and lynch in 1672. He moved, and to clear up the misunderstandings as an atheist, he devoted himself to writing his major work, but he died in 1677. After that, his Ethica was published.
It hardly seems like a century of reason. Spinoza would fear to be lynched too. However, was he not an atheist?
No. His Ethica rather began with the proof of God's existence, through the pseudo-geometrical method, deriving theorems from definitions and axioms. According to it, an entity is unique and absolute, so it is God, and God is the world. He said, Deus sub natura, namely, God equals nature.
In both of Judaism and Christianity, the distinction between the creator and the creations is fundamental, right?
His theology was neither Judaism nor Christianity, but Pantheism, which regards this world as God. In addition, the God as the world, has diverse attributes. However, we humans can recognize only thoughts and extensions of them. Both are originally the same event of God, so they are always in sync. This solution to the mind-body problem is called parallelism.
Is it like capturing the same performance on film and audio at the same time?
About humans, as well as God and the world, the mind and the body are from the beginning the same entity. Moreover, an idea in our minds is the same as our will for the physical stimulation of our bodies. We are moved by joy and sorrow, to make us closer or farther to the perfect. If it is accompanied by the idea of external cause, it is love or hate. Reason requires us to love ourselves, namely, to make us closer to the perfect. For that, we need to recognize, not immediate individual matters, but the bigger stronger thing to move us, namely, the whole of the world or God, under the aspect of eternity.
In short, he said don't get distracted by small things and look at the big picture, right? However, the God he speaks of doesn't seem God-like at all, because it has no grace or anything for us.
Following Aristotle, who said nature abhors a vacuum, people at the time, including Descartes, believed that space was filled with ether. However, although Gassendi was a professor in mathematics at Collège de France, he was devoted to the ancient Epicurus about 300 BC, and after he died, his Syntagma Philosophicum was published in 1658, introducing atomism of Epicurus. Descartes believed that matter could be divided infinitely, so the Cartesians strongly opposed the atomic theory.
The theologians and the Cartesians would not allow atomism, because a vacuum would mean a flaw in God's creation.
Meanwhile, von Guericke, the mayor of Magdeburg, worked to recover from the 30 Years' War. Improving fire pumps, he performed experiments, and, through that, the space did not transmit sound. He confirmed that it is the very vacuum without ether. He also discovered the change in atmospheric pressure, opening the door to meteorology.
What an interesting mayor, conducting an experiment like this using a pump that was left over from the war.
After Francis Bacon and alchemical Rosicrucianism, Boyle, an Irish landowner and Galileo's pupil, formed the Invisible College, with his colleagues, exchanging information about scientific research. However, Britain at the time was unstable, due to the Puritan Revolution in 1642, and the Restoration in 1660, so they might be suspected as a conspiratorial group. Therefore, with the charter of the king, they established the Royal Society.
Did he really organize a secret scientific society?
Boyle wanted to reproduce Guericke's vacuum experiments, but it needed a too-big pump. So he first invented a pneumatical engine, equipment with a cylinder, the sealed bottom of that can be raised and lowered using a gear. With that, he found the so-called Boyle's law, that the volume of a gas is inversely proportional to its pressure. Anyway, the fact that a gas can change volume, suggests that the components of the gas inherently contain gaps. In addition, through distinguishing compounds from pure matters and mere mixtures, so he got a prescience of some smaller particles, configuring compounds.
As Gassendi's revival of atomism suggests, a vacuum has been in fact everywhere.
However, following Aristotle, most scholars believed as ever that there is no vacuum in the world, and that any matter is infinitely divisible. But they considered no longer the stars to be gods, and to move on their own. The stars are just dead matter, so they assumed the wind of the ether, filling the universe, that moves the planets around the sun.
Ether was also the fifth element, described by Aristotle, right?
Tycho Brahe, a Danish nobleman, was puzzled by the data of his precise astronomical observations. It showed that Mars was not in an exact orbit around the Sun. Upon his death in 1601, he entrusted the organization of the data to his assistant Kepler. Kepler discovered in 1609 that it was an elliptical orbit with the Sun at one focus, and that the angular area was constant. So, Descartes had to think a more complex vortex of the ether wind in the universe, and it was published in 1656 after he died.
Descartes would think of Mars as a barrel drifting in the whirlpools of a strait.
Young British Newton was picked out to the professor at Cambridge University, invented the method of fluxions, and published it in 1671. It is a method of calculating the increase or decrease flowing into or out to a total amount of liquid, with a general variable formula, and by ignoring the square of an instant moment as zero, he derived a differential equation. Around the same time, young German dilettante diplomat Leibniz, during his stay in Paris, also discovered the same differential equation, by simply calculating the slope of a graph as the tangent of the point, through analytical geometry of Descartes.
With the fluid studies, would Newton want to explain the ether wind?
By the way, in the pendulum experiments, Galileo found that height and speed are interchangeable. So, Descartes supposed vis vita, namely living power, as the product of mass and velocity. However, from Galileo's fall experiment, that showed something dropped from 4 times the height, goes twice as fast, Leibniz distinguished force from vis vita, namely, power from momentum, and insisted that, not bodies with extension, but forces are true entities, in his Discourse on Metaphysics, in 1686.
Oh, did Leibniz find Descartes' mistake?
Newton realized that, force which Leibniz distinguished from vis vita, is the product of mass and acceleration. Furthermore, applying this equation of motion to the orbits of planets, he discovered that the gravitational force acts remotely on the Sun and planets. He developed it to the universal gravitation theory, in Principia, in 1687. However, how it is transmitted is a mystery, and Newton did not answer it, saying, "I do not make any hypotheses."
Although Newton and Leibniz were rivals, they unexpectedly developed science together.
Light was once a divine attribute. However, Kepler discovered that light decays inversely with the square of the distance. So Descartes regarded it as a sort of wave-like sound, but light goes through even a vacuum, differently from sound.
If light were of God, it would never decay. As well as stars, light was now just an object of science.
Inspired by the blurring in a telescope, Newton succeeded in separating light into a color spectrum, through a prism. It meant, light is some compound. So he proposed the particle theory of light, in 1704. Thus, the universe does not need more of the filling ether to transmit light, and for Newton, the universe became a pure absolute space-time, only with an extension, like Descartes' geometric coordinate.
However, it has not been proved yet that the universe is a vacuum.
Meanwhile, as a Hanoverian diplomat, Leibniz worked hard to unify the old and new churches in Germany, to counter King Louis XVI of France. Although he failed German religious unification, and was involved in a calculus dispute with the British supporting Newton, he achieved union with Britain, by making the Elector of Hanover inherit the British throne as well, in 1714.
The pioneer race with Newton also had such political backgrounds, didn't it?
For Leibniz, diplomacy was a game of power. As early as 1686 in his Discourse on Metaphysics, he had considered, the entities of the world are not bodies with extension, but points with power. Therefore, he needed no longer to distinguish between the mind and the body like Descartes, even God is just a point of power too. He called such an entity with power, generally, monad.
He might be the metaphysical world, like Gilling's may branch on Spinoza's aspect of God.
According to his monadology in 1714, monads are discrete. Indeed, they are similar to chemical particles, but they have no volume, namely, they are just points with independent forces. They remember the same world imaged by God, and express themselves by respectively reflecting it, so that, although without mutual relation, they seem, as if they cooperate, and there is a remote power. He called the phenomenon, pre-established harmony.
It looks like karaoke rooms, where everyone is respectively singing the same popular song. Although he thought, thus he had solved the remote action by gravity, his metaphysical world rather consisted only of remote gravity points. Then, how would he treat something like a continuous fluid?
Anyway, the bizarre rationalism that Descartes made, was almost wiped out, by Newton and Leibniz. Thus, we conquered the ruling theology, and entered into the age of science.